Why did Jesus say, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" The crucifixion of Jesus Christ is a pivotal event in the New Testament that symbolizes his ultimate sacrifice for the sins of humanity. This event is considered a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies, and it is marked by a mix of betrayal, drama, and the fulfillment of prophecy. Jesus' arrest was characterized by betrayal, but he remained committed to fulfilling God's prophecies and will. Despite having the opportunity to avoid suffering, Jesus chose to face his fate, demonstrating his obedience to God's plan and his love for humanity. The crucifixion of Jesus Christ is a central event and is recounted in the New Testament. Jesus was then severely whipped, mocked, and forced to carry his cross to the site of execution, known as Golgotha, or the place of the skull. Matthew 27:27-31. He was nailed to the cross and hung between two criminals. Above his head there was a sign that read, "King of the Jews." He had been scorned, mocked, surrounded by enemies, and had his feet pierced. While on the cross, Jesus made several significant statements. And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani?" That is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And some of those who were standing there when they heard it said, "This man is calling for Elijah." And immediately one of them ran, and taking a sponge, he filled it with sour wine and put it on a reed and gave him a drink. But the rest of them said, "Let us see if Elijah comes to save him." Matthew 27:46-49, Amplified Bible. Jesus only spoke this saying in both the Gospels of Matthew and Mark. It is the only expression that appears in more than one Gospel. By quoting Psalm 22, Jesus proclaimed that he fulfilled the prophecy, both in its agony and exaltation. Following this, the psalm continues by saying, "You have answered me. I will declare your name to my brethren. Amid the congregation, I will praise you." We read that he cried. This is a strong verb indicating powerful emotion or appeal to God. This is remarkably the only time in the Synoptic Gospels where Jesus addressed God without calling him Father. Jesus says, "Why have you forsaken me?" Throughout his life, Jesus suffered a great deal, both physically and emotionally. However, he had never experienced the feeling of being apart from his Father. But at a certain moment, he went through something completely new. He felt abandoned by the Father for the first time in his life. At that moment, there was a sacred transaction that took place. God the Father considered Jesus as if he were a sinner. As the Apostle Paul later wrote in 2 Corinthians 5:21, New American Standard Bible, "He made him who knew no sin to be sin in our behalf, so that we might become the righteousness of God in him." Jesus, as a substitute for humanity's sin, endured both the withdrawal of the Father's fellowship and the outpouring of his wrath. Have you ever pondered on how even the most terrible events can fit into God's plan of redemption? It's a difficult concept to grasp, but Isaiah understood it well when he said in Isaiah 53:10, New American Standard Bible, "But the Lord desired to crush him, causing him grief. If he renders himself as a guilt offering, he will see his offspring. He will prolong his days, and the good pleasure of the Lord will prosper in his hand." The cry of Jesus on the cross was agonizing. it's uncommon for humans to feel grief at the thought of being separated from God, or to imagine themselves as deserving of his wrath. Yet, this was the true agony that Jesus experienced. Before Jesus' death, and before the veil was torn, an incredible spiritual transaction took place. God the Father placed all the guilt and wrath of our sins upon God the Son, who bore them perfectly and completely satisfied the wrath of God on our behalf. This event ensured that we are forgiven and reconciled to God. Although the physical agony that Jesus endured was terrible, it was the spiritual anguish of being condemned for our sins in our place that Jesus dreaded the most about the crucifixion. This was the cup of God's righteous wrath that he trembled at drinking. Jesus anticipated a painful death filled with humiliation and insults. He prayed to God that if there was another way to avoid the cup of wrath, it would be done. Jesus, however, submitted to God's will and said, "Yet not my will, but yours be done." By bracketing his request on both ends with a commitment to do God's will, Jesus demonstrated his utmost obedience to God. As Jesus faces rejection and death, he lays his burdens before God. This portrays a very human side of Jesus, as he confronts his death with a range of emotions. However, Luke's portrayal of Jesus does not conceal his divinity. He shows Jesus as someone who can understand our flaws and traumas. His pain was not simple, but rather complex. We can only begin to comprehend his agony by remembering that he had to bear the penalty that sin deserved for millions upon millions of people. In the garden, Jesus' humanity is fully revealed. Jesus' humanity is fully seen here in the garden. On the cross, Jesus drank the cup of the Father's fury. He did it so that we would not have to drink that cup. Isaiah 53, 3-5 puts it this way. Isaiah 53, 3-5, New American Standard Bible. He was despised and abandoned by men, a man of great pain and familiar with sickness. And like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we had no regard for him. However, it was our sicknesses that he himself bore, and our pains that he carried. Yet we ourselves assumed that he had been afflicted, struck down by God, and humiliated. But he was pierced for our offenses. He was crushed for our wrongdoings. The punishment for our well-being was laid upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. We can try to fathom the answer to the question Jesus asked, why? The answer could be, because, my son, you willingly chose to take the place of guilty sinners. You, who have never sinned, decided to make the ultimate sacrifice by taking on the sins of the world and receiving my just wrath upon sin and sinners. Connection to David's Psalm 22. The events of Jesus' crucifixion echo the sentiments expressed by King David. My God, why have you forsaken me? Psalm 22, 1. Many people do not know that David was a prophet. While the Psalms show emotional moments in his life, many Psalms were a picture of what was yet to happen. Psalm 22 is a vivid prophecy of suffering and feels like a direct description of Jesus' experience on the cross. It describes afflictions remarkably similar to those Jesus endured. The connection between Jesus' crucifixion and Old Testament prophecy is significant. It demonstrates that Jesus was the Messiah foretold in the Hebrew Scriptures. The similarities between Psalm 22 and the crucifixion account strengthen the belief that Jesus' suffering and death were part of God's divine plan and purpose. This psalm is a precious gem as it portrays the profound and intense sufferings of Christ. Psalm 22, 1-2, a psalm of David. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me and from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I call out by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I find no rest nor quiet. This psalm begins with a distressing scene of someone who trusts God crying out in agony after feeling forsaken. Although this psalm accurately describes the life experiences of King David, it is even more applicable to Jesus the Messiah. He deliberately chose these words to describe the agony he felt on the cross. It is highly likely that Jesus meditated on the Old Testament during his suffering and saw his crucifixion as a fulfillment of Psalm 22. It is certain that David might have experienced this feeling, but it would have been a mere shadow compared to how Jesus experienced it. Before his crucifixion, Jesus lived every moment in a state of conscious fellowship with God the Father, accompanied by a continual reliance on both the Father and the Spirit for help. However, at the time of his crucifixion, Jesus felt helpless and abandoned, as it seemed that the Father was far away and not coming to his aid. If you want to know how Jesus felt, read through Psalms 22. Psalm 22, 12-18, New American Standard Bible. Many bulls have surrounded me. Strong bulls of Bashan have encircled me. They open their mouths wide at me, as a ravening and roaring lion. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, it is melted within me. My strength is dried up like a piece of pottery, and my tongue clings to my jaws. And you lay me in the dust of death, for dogs have surrounded me. A band of evildoers has encompassed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones. They look, they stare at me. They divide my garments among them, and they cast lots for my clothing. The Forsaken One urgently recounts his dire plight, likening his oppressors to mighty bulls of Bashan, formidable beasts whose strength and size seem insurmountable. We read, I am poured out like water. The Forsaken One felt completely depleted. He had no strength left to face the current crisis. We then read, my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It has melted within me. This passage describes both the physical suffering of David and the prophesied suffering of the Son of David on the cross. The crucified man was placed in a posture that was purposefully difficult and strained. The physical agony of crucifixion was depicted by David with the precision of a prophet of the Lord, despite the fact that David was not aware of the practice of crucifixion during his time period. We read, you have brought me to the dust of death. David used this moving poetic phrase to describe the extent of his misery. Obviously, David did not perish during the crisis that is depicted in this psalm. He lived to write additional psalms. He had reached the edge of death. Yet Jesus, the Son of David, did not only approach the brink of death, rather he was thrown into the dust of death. We read, for dogs have surrounded me. The assembly of the wicked has enclosed me. David's predicament would have been a terrible one, even if he were surrounded by friends who were sympathetic. Nonetheless, his anguish was compounded by the fact that there were violent and wicked men on every side. Few people were sympathetic to the Son of David when he passed away. As Jesus was hanging on the cross, he was surrounded by people who mocked, and mocked. They wanted to make his suffering even worse. We read, "They pierced my hands and my feet." In his writings, the prophet David provided a description of the wounds that his greater son would bear as a result of the crucifixion. We read, "They look and stare at me." In his crisis, David was the subject of unwelcome attention. Not only did his tormentors not allow him the dignity of private agony, but they also exposed everything to their gaze. In addition, David's great son was unable to conceal himself from the unwelcome gazes of cruel and ridiculing individuals when he was hanging on the cross. "They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." David was so humiliated in front of his attackers and so helpless in the face of them that they even stole his clothing and used it for their own purposes. Psalm 22 was fulfilled in a manner that was even more literal in the experience of Jesus than it was in the life of David. This is similar to other features of the passage. At the very foot of the cross, soldiers gambled, cast lots for the garments that Jesus would wear on his crucifixion. This was done in accordance with the customs that were prevalent at that historical period. The sight of the agonizing body ought to have ensured sympathy from the crowd, but it only increased their vicious glee. Psalm 22, 24-25, New American Standard Bible. "For he was not despised nor scorned the suffering of the afflicted, nor has he hidden his face from him. But when he cried to him for help, he heard. From you comes my praise in the great assembly. I shall pay my vows before those who fear him." Jesus of Nazareth fulfills the messianic prophecy of the Lord's suffering servant. Isaiah 53:12, Mark 15:28, Luke 24:46. Jesus' expression of feeling forsaken makes him deeply relatable to us. In times of suffering or feeling abandoned, we can find peace in knowing that Jesus himself experienced these intense human emotions. This important event is key to what we believe. It shows that Jesus didn't just die a sad death, he died on purpose. This act was meant to fix the relationship between humans and God. We see Jesus as the Savior who, by going through pain and dying, brought people back together with God. Number 4. Why Jesus had to meet Moses and Elijah at the Mount of Transfiguration. There are certain places on our planet that possess an otherworldly quality. The Mountain of Transfiguration is one such location. During this event, it seemed as though the boundary between our world and the divine was erased for a brief moment. This moment holds significant mystical importance in the New Testament. Imagine this scene. Jesus leads 3 of his disciples, namely Peter, James, and John, up a high mountain. They are uncertain of what they will find at the top. However, upon reaching the summit, an unimaginable sight unfolds before their eyes. Jesus, who they have known as a man, suddenly becomes radiant, shining with a brilliance akin to the sun. As if this weren't astonishing enough, 2 great figures from the past, Moses and Elijah, appear beside him, conversing with him like old friends. Matthew 17:2, Amplified Bible. and his appearance changed dramatically in their presence, and his face shone with heavenly glory, clear and bright like the sun, and his clothing became as white as light. On a mountain, Jesus shone with divine radiance, revealing his true glory as the Son of God. His disciples, Peter, James, and John, witnessed the spectacle and were amazed to see Moses and Elijah conversing with him as if they were old friends. This experience was a powerful sign that Jesus was deeply connected to the grand history and prophecies of Israel. Though the event was brief, it left an indelible mark on the disciples, who would never forget the glimpse they had into the true nature of their teacher and friend. Join me in exploring this story and uncovering the deeper messages it holds for us today. They headed back down the mountain, a bit dazed and overwhelmed. Jesus, however, gave them strict orders not to tell anyone what they had seen until after he had risen from the dead. They obeyed, but they were left with questions burning in their hearts, pondering what the vision truly meant and what Jesus' reference to his resurrection implied. Peter, always the impulsive one, interjects. Matthew 17:4, Amplified Bible. Then Peter began to speak and said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good and delightful and auspicious that we are here. If you wish, I will put up 3 sacred tents here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." Perhaps Peter, in his excitement, wishes to preserve this moment, creating a permanent reminder of this divine assembly. Yet the climax is still to come. Matthew 17:5, Amplified Bible. While he was still speaking, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased and delighted. Listen to him." In the transfiguration event, a voice from heaven recalls another moment in Jesus' baptism, where a similar proclamation was made, Matthew 3:17. This affirmation confirms Jesus' identity and mission without any doubt. After the event, Jesus instructed his disciples to keep it a secret until after his resurrection, implying that while the transfiguration was a preview of his glory, the complete story was yet to unfold with his death and resurrection. Matthew 17:10, Amplified Bible. The disciples asked him, "Then why do the scribes say that Elijah must come first?" Moses. Moses was a humble shepherd who was chosen by God to lead the Israelites out of bondage in Egypt. However, like all humans, Moses wasn't immune to death. Despite his pivotal role and close relationship with God, he couldn't enter the promised land because of previous disobedience. In the book of Deuteronomy, it is written, Deuteronomy 34:5-6, Amplified Bible. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And he buried him in the valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor. But no man knows where his burial place is to this day. Although Moses' time on earth came to an end, his story continued. Hundreds of years later, Jesus arrived at the embodiment of God's love and salvation. Moses represented the law given by God, while Jesus embodied the grace and truth that came through him. The Transfiguration event bridged the gap between old and new, between the law and grace, between Moses and Jesus. Moses' appearance with Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration symbolized God's plan of salvation, which remained consistent throughout history. Elijah. Elijah was one of the most important and dynamic prophets of the Old Testament. He lived in a time when Israel had turned away from the true God and worshipped idols, especially under the rule of the wicked king Ahab and his wife Jezebel. Elijah's mission was to call the people of Israel back to God. What is transfiguration? What does transfiguration mean? Why is it happening now? The mountain of transfiguration is not just about a change in appearance. It is a profound testament to Jesus' divine nature and his unique place in the great narrative of God's relationship with humanity. During the Transfiguration, Jesus briefly showed his divine side. It proved that he was connected to God and that he continued the work of past leaders like Moses and Elijah. For Peter, James, and John, it was like a sign that confirmed their beliefs and gave them a preview of wonderful things in the future. Significance of the Mountain of Transfiguration. In the Bible, mountains were not merely big hills or rocky spots. They hold significant importance as they are the places where crucial and life-changing events occur. Due to their height, they seem to be nearer to the sky and thus closer to God as well. Consider Moses and Mount Sinai, for instance. It was on this mountain that Moses met God and received the Ten Commandments, laws that would shape the moral and spiritual fabric of the Israelites for generations. The mountain became the meeting point between the divine and the mortal. Fast forward to the New Testament was the transfiguration of Jesus. The disciples, seeing Moses and Elijah appearing and talking with Jesus, was not just a display of divine majesty, but a significant moment. What the Mountain of Transfiguration represents. Number 1. Divine confirmation. The voice from heaven confirms Jesus' identity as the Son of God and emphasizes the importance of his teachings. Number 2. A place of revelation. Just as Moses received the law on Mount Sinai, the Transfiguration Mountain becomes a place where the disciples receive deeper insight into Jesus' nature and mission. Number 3. Continuity. The presence of Moses and Elijah shows the connection between the Old Testament and Jesus' mission. It implies that Jesus is the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. What happened? The Bible doesn't give a detailed account of the conversation between Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. However, we know from Luke's account, Luke 9:30-31, Amplified Bible. And behold, 2 men were talking with him, and they were Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory, and were speaking of his departure from earthly life, which he was about to bring to fulfillment at Jerusalem. In simple terms, the Transfiguration is a bridging moment. It connects the Old Testament stories and prophecies with the New Testament's revelation of Jesus as the Messiah. The past and the present converge on this mountain, revealing Jesus as the connecting point between them. This suggests they discussed the mission Jesus was to complete in Jerusalem, which was his impending suffering, death, and resurrection. Bridging the past and the present. In Matthew 17:1-11, we find a profound event, one that ties together many aspects of the scriptures. Mountains stand out in biblical narratives as places of encounters with God. Moses met God on Mount Sinai. Elijah had his own transformative experience on Mount Horeb. And now Jesus chooses a mountain as the stage for a pivotal revelation. Moses and Elijah, 2 towering figures from the Old Testament. Moses represents the law, having given the 10 Commandments to the Israelites. Elijah embodies the prophets, known for his zeal for the Lord and his confrontations with idolatry. Their presence with Jesus signifies a profound truth. Jesus is the fulfillment of both the law and the prophets. Jesus fulfilling the law. In the scriptures, the law refers primarily to the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. These books contain a blend of history, prophecy, and commandments that God gave to the Israelites through the prophet Moses. Yet, the law was more than a set of rules. It was a mirror showing humanity their imperfections and sinfulness. No one could perfectly keep the entire law, making it clear that everyone needed redemption. In Romans 10:4, the Apostle Paul states, "For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes." This doesn't mean the law is irrelevant, but that its purpose is fulfilled in Jesus. It points to him as the answer to humanity's need for redemption. In other words, Jesus didn't discard the law. He lived it, loved it, and fulfilled it. In him, the shadows of the law found their substance, and the prophecies of old found their answer. Through Jesus, the law's ultimate goal, to bring humanity into a right relationship with God, was accomplished.